A man once told me something that stayed with me for a long time. He said, "The strange thing about losing someone's respect is that nobody tells you when it happens. There is no conversation, no moment where someone sits across from you and says, 'I no longer respect you the way I used to.' Instead, something much quieter begins to unfold. At first, everything still looks the same. You still talk, you still see each other, you still share the same spaces, the same routines, the same conversations. But if you pay close attention, something begins to feel different. The way they listen changes. The way they respond changes. The weight your words carry in the conversation begins to shift. And the strange part is that most people don't recognize it right away, because the signs are small. So small that they are easy to dismiss. You tell yourself, maybe they're just stressed. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe I'm overthinking it. But respect rarely disappears all at once. It fades quietly through patterns. Small behaviors repeated over time. Behaviors that slowly reveal something important about how someone sees you. And when those patterns appear, they often reveal a shift that many people try very hard not to acknowledge. Because recognizing it forces you to ask a difficult question. Has something in this relationship changed? Now here's the important truth. Respect is not built in grand moments. It is built in the small ones. In how someone listens when you speak. In how they treat your time. In whether your presence still carries value in the relationship. And when respect begins to fade, the first signs are almost always quiet. You won't hear them announced. But if you learn to notice them, you will begin seeing relationships much more clearly. Today, we're going to explore some of the quiet signs that someone may have stopped respecting you. Not so you become suspicious of every relationship in your life, but so you develop something far more valuable: awareness. Because when you understand the patterns that shape relationships, you gain the ability to protect your dignity, your peace, and your time. And if you're here with us on Tilt and Chill, I'm really glad you joined this conversation. This channel exists for people who want to think more deeply about their lives and their relationships. So take a moment, get comfortable, and listen closely. Because once you learn to see these quiet signs, you will never look at relationships the same way again. Part 1. When being heard slowly turns into being dismissed. Most people believe respect disappears during arguments. They imagine it fades in loud moments, during conflict, disagreement, or some obvious betrayal. But that's rarely how it actually happens. Respect usually fades much more quietly. It begins in everyday conversations, in the subtle way someone starts responding to you differently. At first, the change is so small you almost miss it. There might be a moment when you're explaining something that matters to you, and instead of curiosity or engagement, the response is quick, almost impatient. Not rude enough to confront, but different enough that you notice. You might say something thoughtful, something you've been reflecting on, and the response comes back with a simple comment like, "Yeah, but that's just how things are." Or perhaps the conversation moves on before your point ever really lands. At first, you don't think much about it. Everyone has distracted moments. Everyone gets tired. Everyone occasionally misses what someone else is trying to say. But then you notice it happening again and again. And slowly, the rhythm of conversation begins changing. You start recognizing that when you speak, the other person doesn't quite pause the way they used to. Their attention feels shorter. Their interest feels thinner. Your thoughts begin landing in the room without creating the same reaction they once did. And this is where many people begin doing something almost unconsciously. They start adjusting themselves. They explain things more carefully. They soften their tone. They try to make their point easier to accept, not because they're trying to argue, but because somewhere inside them, they've begun sensing something subtle. Their voice no longer carries the same weight it once did. When respect exists in a relationship, your voice naturally holds influence. Not because someone agrees with everything you say, but because they treat what you say as something worth considering. They listen long enough to understand your perspective. They respond in a way that acknowledges your part of the conversation, not just a background voice. But when that respect begins fading, listening often becomes selective. You might notice that certain topics are brushed aside quickly. Certain concerns are minimized. Certain thoughts are treated as if they're unnecessary complications rather than meaningful contributions. And here's the difficult part. Most people don't immediately confront this change. Instead, they try to restore the balance. They become more patient, more accommodating, more careful about how they express themselves. They try to keep the conversation calm, reasonable, and easy for the other person to accept. But over time, something quietly begins happening. They speak less. Not because they have less to say, but because they have learned that saying it may not change anything. And that realization is often one of the first quiet signs that respect has shifted. Because respect does something very simple in human interaction. It creates space. Space for both people to exist fully in the conversation. Space for disagreement without dismissal. Space for each voice to carry meaning. When that space begins shrinking for one person, the dynamic begins changing. And the change is rarely announced. It reveals itself through patterns, through the subtle ways someone stops engaging with what you bring into the conversation, through moments where your thoughts seem to pass by without landing. Now, this doesn't always mean someone intends to be disrespectful. Sometimes people fall into habits without noticing them. Sometimes familiarity makes them less attentive. But intention doesn't erase the effect. Because when someone's voice slowly begins disappearing inside a relationship, something important is happening. The balance that once existed is beginning to shift. And when you start noticing that shift, it often leads to a deeper question. Not a question about the conversation, but a question about the relationship itself. Why does it feel like I'm being heard less than before? That question matters, because awareness is the first step toward understanding the patterns that shape your relationships. And once you begin noticing how someone listens to you, or stops listening, you begin seeing something even more revealing. Respect doesn't only appear in how someone hears your voice. It also appears in how they respond when you express a boundary. And in the next part, we're going to explore why that moment often reveals more about a relationship than any conversation ever could. Part 2. When your boundaries begin to feel optional. There is a moment that many people experience in relationships that is easy to overlook at first. It happens when you express a boundary, and the response you receive tells you more than the words themselves. At the beginning of a healthy relationship, boundaries are usually respected naturally, not because someone is afraid of crossing them, but because they value the person on the other side of them. If you say something makes you uncomfortable, it matters. If you ask for something to be handled differently, it is considered. There may be discussion, there may even be disagreement, but there is still acknowledgement that what you said carries weight. Respect does something very simple in that moment. It pauses. It listens. It adjusts. But when respect begins fading, something different begins to happen. The boundary is no longer treated as something meaningful. Instead, it begins feeling negotiable. Sometimes the response is subtle. You express a concern, and the reply comes back lightly dismissive. Don't take it so seriously. You're reading too much into that. Relax, it's not that big of a deal. The words themselves may not sound harsh. In fact, they may even be spoken casually, but the message underneath them is revealing. What you felt is being minimized. At first, many people respond to this in a way that feels reasonable. They explain themselves. They clarify what they meant. They try to communicate more carefully so the other person understands. Because most people don't set boundaries to create distance. They set them because they want the relationship to remain healthy. But if the pattern continues, the response slowly becomes familiar. You notice that the boundary is acknowledged in conversation, but ignored in behavior. The same situation happens again. The same comment appears again. The same pattern repeats itself. And now the dynamic begins changing. Instead of the boundary protecting your space, it begins feeling like a suggestion. Something the other person hears, but does not truly take seriously. This is one of the quiet signs that respect may be shifting in the relationship. Not because someone openly challenges your boundary, but because they treat it as flexible, something that can be crossed without consequence. Many people experience this moment and begin questioning themselves. They wonder if they are being too sensitive, if they are asking for too much, if they are creating unnecessary tension. And in that uncertainty, they often begin softening the boundary they tried to express. They laugh it off. They drop the subject. They decide it's easier to move forward than to keep explaining why it matters. But something important happens when a boundary is repeatedly softened. The other person learns something about the dynamic. They learn that the boundary does not actually limit their behavior, that it can be crossed, apologized for, and eventually forgotten. And slowly, the relationship begins operating under a new assumption. Your limits are flexible. Your discomfort will pass. Your patience will hold the relationship together. Now, this does not mean the other person is always acting with bad intentions. Sometimes people fall into patterns without realizing the impact of their behavior. But intention does not change the effect. Because when someone repeatedly ignores a boundary, the message being communicated becomes clear. Your needs are not carrying the same importance they once did. And this is where many people begin sensing something deeper about the relationship. They realize that respect is not just about words. It is about behavior that aligns with those words. Anyone can acknowledge a boundary in conversation. Respect is revealed when that acknowledgement shows up in action, when behavior actually changes, and when that change never appears. Something important is being revealed. Not about your boundary, but about how the relationship is being prioritized. This realization is rarely comfortable, but it is often necessary. Because once you begin noticing how someone responds when you protect your space, you begin seeing the relationship more clearly. And clarity leads to a deeper question that many people eventually ask themselves. If my voice carries less weight, and my boundaries feel optional, what does that say about how this relationship truly values me? In the next part, we're going to explore one of the most revealing signs of all. It's not about conversations, and it's not about boundaries. It appears in something even more subtle. The way someone begins speaking about you when they no longer believe your presence needs to be honored. Part 3. When your presence stops changing the room. There is one sign of fading respect that many people only recognize after it has been happening for a long time. It is not always visible in what someone says to you. Sometimes it appears in something even more revealing: the way someone behaves when you are present. At the beginning of a healthy relationship, your presence naturally influences the environment, not because you demand control, but because there is a quiet understanding that you matter in the space. Your feelings are considered. Your reactions are taken into account. If a conversation begins moving in a direction that would clearly upset you, people notice. They adjust. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Respect creates that awareness naturally. It makes people conscious of how their actions affect the other person in the room. But when respect begins to fade, that awareness often fades with it. At first, the change can feel almost invisible. Someone says something that lightly undermines you in front of others. A comment that feels slightly dismissive. Something framed as humor, but with an edge that makes the room pause for a moment. If the respect in the relationship is strong, moments like this are rare. And if they do happen, they are usually corrected quickly. The person notices the discomfort. They acknowledge it. They repair the moment. But when respect has quietly shifted, those moments often pass without recognition. The comment hangs in the air. The conversation moves forward, and the subtle message becomes clearer each time it happens. Your presence is no longer shaping the way the other person behaves. This does not always appear through obvious disrespect. Sometimes it shows up in something simpler. You might notice someone speaking about you in ways they never would have before. Not directly insulting, but casually dismissive. They may reveal personal details about you in front of others without considering how it affects you. They may make decisions that impact you without feeling the need to include you in the conversation. These moments often feel uncomfortable, but difficult to explain. Because if you try to describe them, they sound small, insignificant, easy for someone else to dismiss. But the pattern behind them is not small. It reveals something important about how the relationship dynamic has changed. Respect creates a kind of invisible boundary around a person. It protects their dignity. It influences how others speak about them, how they are represented in conversations, and how their presence is acknowledged. When that boundary disappears, the difference becomes noticeable. People begin acting in ways they would not have acted before. And many people respond to this shift in a familiar way. They try to earn the respect back. They become more agreeable, more patient, more understanding. They believe that if they handle the situation carefully enough, the relationship will return to the way it once felt. But respect rarely returns through accommodation alone. In many cases, the opposite happens. The more someone accepts dismissive behavior without addressing it, the more normal that behavior becomes in the relationship. Now, this realization is not meant to create anger or resentment. It is meant to create clarity. Because one of the most powerful things a person can understand about relationships is this: respect is not sustained by how much you tolerate. It is sustained by the value you place on your own dignity. When you recognize that your presence deserves consideration, when you understand that your voice deserves space, when you protect the boundaries that preserve your self-respect, the dynamic of your relationships begins changing. Sometimes people rise to meet that clarity. They adjust. They recognize the shift and respond with renewed respect. Other times, the relationship struggles to adapt. But even that outcome provides something valuable. It reveals whether the connection was built on mutual regard or on the quiet assumption that your patience would carry everything forward. And once you begin seeing these patterns clearly, something important changes inside you. You stop questioning your instincts. You stop ignoring the signals that once felt difficult to name. And you begin choosing relationships where your voice, your time, and your presence all carry the weight they deserve. Because the healthiest relationships do not require you to shrink in order to maintain them. They expand when both people understand something simple but powerful. Respect is not demanded, it is demonstrated. And once you learn to recognize when it is present, and when it is quietly fading, you gain something that protects every relationship you will ever build in the future. Awareness.